I can't see you in the back there, so if you get it powered up, that's great. If not, somebody kind of wave your hands and I'll yell codes at you and people can hack into my computer later and steal all my fabulous stuff. Listen, I wanted to take you on a bit of a survey of the industry as we see it right now. And I think if you step back for a minute and say what's happened really as we went through the Great Recession and started to recover from it, there's a couple of things that I think impact everybody in this room selling into the K-12 space. Number one, obviously we're starting to come out of the Great Recession. And times are getting better, but they're certainly not going to return to the times that you saw pre-recession. And I'll walk you through some of the macroeconomic data on why we believe that to be very true. Secondly, if you're not participating in the digital migration right now, you're probably getting behind times. I know we've been talking about the coming age of digital for years and years and the impact it'll have, but at Parthenon we've seen real evidence in the past, say, probably 24 to 36 months now that the digital transformation is coming. It will come slowly. Don't expect classrooms to go 100% digital overnight. That's a very unrealistic expectation. But we'll walk you through some data that I think will demonstrate that if you don't have digital componentry built into your products or services that you're trying to move into school districts, you're going to have a really, really tough headwind in the market. So it's really time to take stock and to start to be smart about the digital transition. I'll talk a little bit about Common Core, or the standards formerly known as Common Core. And I think what I can say safely is whether we can have a lovely cocktail debate about whether Common Core will survive and thrive or not. But with the word Common Core or not, the standards that underlie Common Core are pretty secure in the nation right now. If you look around, even in Texas and Florida and places, even in Louisiana right now, we may reject the term Common Core, but we often keep the standards that look suspiciously like it. And again, I think as you move into districts and start having dialogues with districts over the next, kind of coming selling season this spring, what you'll find is that, a year and a half or 2 years ago, you could go in and say, hey, I've mapped everything to Common Core. Now they're going to increasingly ask you very uncomfortable questions, which is, have you rewritten your content to be aligned and in tune with the philosophy behind Common Core? And if you haven't, the level of sophistication in the districts is up at a level where they're going to catch you out on that. So those are the topics. I'm hoping, are we semi-booted up back there? What do we think? I could pantomime my slides as well, which would be awesome. I do want to pause for a minute and maybe make sure we get that booted up. Do you need me to come back, or? Yeah, I'm not going to tell you that right now. All right, so we have no slides. I will send the slides out and make them available for everybody afterwards, but we'll go ahead and go through this verbally, and every now and then I'll throw some arms in the air to indicate directions that my slides would indicate. So I talked about the recovering economy, and I want to step into a couple of things that are happening there. Obviously, K-12 funding is a state and local type of activity, right? Funding comes from both property taxes and state revenues. And though we are going through recovery, it's a pretty lagged recovery. And the implications for that are twofold. That number one, this year was the first year that we saw a slight recovery in K-12 funding, and we expect that recovery to continue over the next 3 to 5 years and kind of funding growth in the 3 to 4% range for school districts. But before you get excited about that, keep in mind that school districts' cost basis is rising through health care and benefits and pension planning at about that rate. So most school districts around the nation will be experiencing what they refer to as level services funding, which is they're getting 3 or 4% more, but all of that is being eaten up by statutory requirements. And if you look forward in time, I think the bad news that I have to deliver on K-12 school funding is that unless we make some fundamental policy decisions in this country, that is not going to change over the foreseeable future. And that's because if I sit up at the local level or even at the state house level, the amount of tax revenues that are going to obligations, right? So the pensions and the health care benefits are rising at a faster pace. So if we went back pre-recession, about 40% of state funding went to required, statutory required funding. Today it's up to about 60%. And so K-12 funding, whether we like it or not, is a discretionary item, and it's going to suffer. And unless we make a fundamental break with political policies out there, or continue to write bonds for just about everything at the local school district level, the funding that you saw in the 90s and the early 2000s is not going to return. And the hard implication of that means everything that you sell to a school district is something that someone else did not sell. So this is a share stealing market going forward, as opposed to a market that's selling into an environment with increased funding. And that recovering economy, I think, if you step back and say, so how does that impact the people at the district and the parents and the consumers out there? Districts will continue to perceive themselves as underfunded. So even though the funding is going up, the word you're going to get back is that we're still underfunded. And I think one of the implications as you walk out there is you really have to be able to communicate the value of what you're offering to a district. I think the time of just saying what my product does and how it can impact student learning is past, and you have to be able to talk in terms of not only do I impact student learning, but I impact student learning at a cost that has a real value equation. So kind of demonstrate that return on investment that a district is about to make into a product or service that you're offering. If I flip over onto the parent side, parents are actually starting to lose faith in the ability of school districts to deliver many of the educational programs that they really, really value. If you think about what's been cut back, we've lost arts, sports, we've lost music, we've lost language, we've lost clubs that are after school and things like that. All is, as a district had to make hard choices around funding, all of those things started to get cut out first. And so what you see is if you've got products or services that can help a district economically offer those types of activities, or a path to a consumer channel so a parent can buy those types of activities that they used to get from the district, I think you're going to find very fertile grounds out there. So we call it be very, very traditional. Offer all of the things that most of us in the room would think made a great education: the chess club, the robotics club, language learning in elementary schools. And again, if you have products and services that fit into that category, I think you're going to find receptive ears out there, particularly if you can price it in a manner that is very, very simple for a principal, typically a principal at the building level, to say, you know what, I think that would benefit my students or my teachers or the parents in my community. If you can offer them a product that does that and it's at a low price point that they can buy in a building level, I think you're going to find receptive ears out there. So if I take a walk around, and right now I should have this fabulous square pie chart that demonstrates where all the spending in education is, but we look at the education, the pre-K through 12 education market is about $54 billion of cumulative spend in the private to private providers. About a fifth of that goes into pre-K, so child care and early childhood learning, and about fifth of that goes over to the consumer. And left in the middle is things that districts tend to buy, and or districts, charter schools, and private schools tend to buy. And of that, about $8 billion of it is in the instructional content area. And the instructional content area breaks down. It gets about 40–50% is basal textbooks. But for most of you out here, you're selling into kind of the supplemental area, be it intervention or leveled readers or language programs and things like that. And those markets are about $3 or $4 billion in size. And again, when we walk through and think about the impact on that, I want to talk for a minute about digital migration. Now, this is where my presentation looks very snazzy, actually. What I usually do at this point in time is flash you up a bunch of headlines. So I'm going to read you a few headlines. The iPad, an opportunity to change education. A is for app, how smartphones, handheld computers spark an educational revolution. 5 ways Twitter has changed evolution. I love that concept. Right? Can you imagine the concept of 140 characters revolutionizing education? It just sounds absurd to me. But you read these all the time, right? You read them over and over and over again, and it's hard to turn on the TV and not see a Frontline or a Dateline on digital education and MOOCs in the university landscape. What I'm here to tell you, if you turn the clock back 10 to 30 years ago, you would read almost identical headlines about the computer. Plugged-in generation thinking with computers. Technology in the classroom is a step closer, et cetera. And we all remember when the computer revolution was going to completely alter the way the classroom was taught. What you may not realize is that if I go back 100 years ago, and I'm going to read you this quote Books will soon be obsolete in public schools. Scholars will soon be instructed through the eye. It is possible to teach every branch of human knowledge with the motion picture. Our school system will be completely changed inside of 10 years. That's from Thomas Edison in 1913. So what's the message there? I think the message is all of these technologies get incorporated into classrooms quite nicely. Teachers are consumers. They have iPads and they have Chromebooks at home, and they learn how to use them in the classroom. But the basic rhythm and flow of a classroom is not going to change all that much from our perspective. And the message I try to give on here is, if you are not fitting into the rhythm of that classroom with your product, if you don't meet what we call the classroom workflow, you're probably not going to have great success in the marketplace. You can have a few great adoptions, but your product or your service is not going to be able to move out into a broader audience. And there's some real hard reasons for why that's true. First of all, if you think about the teaching profession, it is one of the largest job classifications in the United States. There are literally millions of teachers out there. And if you think about how they work on a day-to-day basis, they sit in a classroom primarily alone without a lot of interaction while they're actually working on their profession, right? Most teachers are behind a closed door teaching students. And when you think about all of the constituents that surround them, they're incredibly conservative. So parents are very, very conservative, right? We all love digital things, but how many of you would be happy if your son or daughter came home and said, everything we're doing in class is on a computer now, right? As parents, we're conservative. The politicians are conservative. The district administrators are conservative. So there is a real resistance to change, and it's not a resistance from the state of being bad, it's a resistance from a state of, I am going to continue to educate in the way I educate until somebody clearly demonstrates to me that there is a superior way to do it that can also be implemented and work in my classroom. So we talk about fitting into these workflows a lot. The other thing that I want to stress is the remarked unpreparedness for schools to take on large-scale digital implementation. You read about it occasionally in the paper. If you've been following the LA Unified adoption of the iPads with the Pearson componentry, not only was the implementation very troubled, but then when people have gone out, I think it was Inside Higher Ed or EdNET, I can't remember who it was, but somebody just published an article where they had gone out and observed classrooms, and 1 out of 245 of the classrooms was actually using the digital content. Right? The rest were using other content, some of it digital, some of it non-digital. It's difficult to do this. One of my partners, Seth Reynolds, participated in helping start up the School of One in New York City, which was one of the real early super digital adoptions. They spent weeks moving around New York City just to find a school that had the physical infrastructure capability to handle School of One, right? And think about what we're talking about here. It's not just bandwidth into the school. I've got to get bandwidth down the hallway into the classroom. I have to have the ability for 20, 25 students to simultaneously download rich content at the same time. And by the way, I have to have power cords for them all. Right? We don't even have enough outlets in the classroom to power up all the devices. And you can't snake extension cords all over the place. So there are really, really difficult things that need to be overcome. Now, why that's important is to think about how things do fit into a classroom. At the same time that I say it's difficult to do a school-wide implementation, every school in the nation pretty much has the ability to roll computers into the classroom for a temporary period of time, the COWs, right, computers on wheels. Every school in the nation can throw a couple laptops or a couple tablet devices into a classroom, and every school in the nation probably has a computer lab down the hall that they can send students to. Teachers, while they tend to be reluctant to have all 24 kids working on a computer at the same time, are actually quite happy to have a group of 5 or 6 doing something on a computer while they're working with another group one-on-one and another group is doing some independent reading or independent study, right? So these workflows that they have that they've built up for years and years actually accommodate a lot of the digital educational materials quite well. And again, if you think about how your content or your service is going to be implemented in a classroom in a digital environment like that, you find that if I'm down in the elementary school, I really have to think, how can it be used in group learning? How can it be used in pull-out type of activities? How can it be used for, a check for understanding or something like that? And if you look around, you'll see that the products that have been really successful tend to fit into one of those categories. Another thing that I think is in your favor right now is the change in acceptance on behalf of administrators and superintendents. We did a survey, I guess it was about a year ago now, fall of last year, where we went out and asked superintendents. There's a whole bunch of stuff about digital acceptance, but the one that I thought was the most telling is we said, if you're trying to improve student outcomes and you have a pile of money to apply towards improving student outcomes, would you rather A, apply that to reduce classroom size, or B, put technology in the hands of your teachers? And superintendents chose technology at a 5-to-1 ratio. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that after 15, 20 some odd years of progressively reducing class size by hiring on more teachers, superintendents are coming to a point where they're saying, you know what, maybe actually enhancing the productivity of my professional staff is a better option than trying to get class size down by another half or a quarter student. I think we've seen that people are believing we may be starting to reach the tipping point of where effectiveness from reducing class size has much more punch behind it. And so they're saying, I'd like to use the digital tools. Now what I'll tell you is that they're pretty savvy about it. They understand it's no silver bullet, it's not a panacea. One of the quotes I got from one superintendent once is, it's a platform, it's not the answer, right? So they're pretty smart about these tools and the need to put them in the hands. And one of the challenges you run into is that the act of discovery for educators is very difficult. I will tell you that most of you selling into the digital space right now don't articulate what your product does very well. I make it a habit to walk around the exhibit halls often at various conferences, and I walk up and I say, what does your product do? And too often what I get is it's an individualized, personalized learning platform in a SaaS-hosted solution, which means absolutely nothing to a district administrator or teacher who's trying to figure out. This act of discovery is very, very difficult. Teachers, chief academic officers, superintendents fundamentally believe that good digital content is out there, and they believe that it can help impact student learning for the good. They're having a very difficult time identifying products that fill the needs they have. So being very, very clear about exactly what your product does is important, right? I met someone last night who has a mobile language program. Very clear. I have a mobile language program on an app for early, fast adoption of language conversation to make a student feel confident in the first 6 weeks. As a principal, I understand that, right? So getting really, really clear about the value proposition. The other thing is know where people are buying digital content. If you go out and just think about the dollars that are spent on digital content right now, about 35% or so of it is spent on remediation, and another 35% or so is spent on supplemental materials for the classroom, right? Not core instructional, but supplemental materials. So 60, 65, 70% of the market really falls into two categories, supplemental instruction and Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention products. And really most of that supplemental material feels a little more like a Tier 1 type of product as well. But when we go out and talk, what you hear about is all the products that actually occupy a very small spot of the spend. ACT and SAT prep, AP classes, foreign languages, special education materials. What we found over and over is that people lead with those. I'm going to bring you rich supplemental materials for gifted and talented for students who want to get ahead. But don't forget that the bulk of the market is still revolving around students. I've got everything going on today. This is my finest hour, I think. Thank you. There's probably a bunch of Chiefs fans in the audience as well. Who's from Kansas City? Yeah, you're dead to me. I'm from Boston. It wasn't nice last night. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate that. I'm going to be benched like Brady in a minute. So don't forget, as you lead with a lot of this rich supplemental content, the dollars, unfortunately, are still being expended to close performance gaps out there. So, I find that many folks go into the marketplace and it's a subtle messaging. If I've got digital online content, yes, I've got foreign languages and AP courses, et cetera, but I also have a really, really good algebra remediation program here, right? Because I need both of those things, but as a superintendent or chief academic officer, I know that the bulk of my spending is probably still going to migrate to closing performance gaps. If you go out and you talk to superintendents, you talk to teachers, you talk to key academic officers, they'll all tell you that in all of their estimations over the next 3 to 5 years, they'll spend less on print, more on digital. But right now, actually, where they're getting most of the digital is free on the internet. So don't make a mistake about what digital often means. Digital content often means the Google, right? I went on and Googled something and I pulled something down. I want to talk about the changes in comfort level. Again, if you went back 3, 4, 5 years, you would find, or at least we found when we did surveys and observations, that most teachers didn't use digital content on a daily basis in their classroom. We're finding that that's changing. Our recent survey said, surveyed teachers, about 60% of them said they use digital content on a daily basis. Now, the depth of that digital content can be very different. But again, what that means is, as a teacher, as I'm going out and trying to discover something that fits into my need, I need good search capability. I need to see your product and in one bullet point understand what it does. And I also need frameworks in order to drop them in. So we're seeing a lot of the lesson planning and kind of lesson planning workflow solutions and software. We think that's going to become very important because I'm being bombarded by things, and it's Sunday night, the game is on, hopefully not the game I saw last night. I'm trying to pull together my lesson plan for the next week, and I've got a chapter from here, I've got a video clip I want, I pulled a speech or a non-literary text from the internet that I didn't use the year before because I wasn't on Common Core, and I have to have a way for this all to come together. So for those of you who are in kind of the lesson planning, workflow solution area on that side, I think you're going to see strong tailwinds going forward. We did the Gates Foundation actually did a survey of digital products out there, and they surveyed. Let me see how many they surveyed. I don't have the in on here. They surveyed 1,000 some odd teachers, and they got thousands and thousands of mentions of the digital product they use. But the top 4,000 mentions, nobody had much market share. So when you go out and survey thousands and thousands of teachers or walk into thousands of classrooms, what you see is that everybody's using something slightly different. So if I just go from the bottom up of the products that were mentioned in this survey, Khan Academy, BrainPop, Accelerated Reader, Edmodo, YouTube, Discovery, Google Docs, Academia Math, just Google search, what you find over and over again is that it's difficult for the teachers. They haven't aggregated around common sites and common locations from which to search for information and educational tools. And then when you ask them how satisfied they are with their ability to find educational content or with their ability to evaluate the quality of the educational content they're looking at, you come up with a surprising answer where 2/3 of them say they're dissatisfied on both of those metrics. Now, when 2/3 of people tell you something's not working for them, that's usually bad. When 2/3 of teachers tell you that, it's really bad, and that's because teachers are a uniquely positive group of people. It's very, very rare that we survey teachers and get negative responses. We usually do 1 to 7 scales. 7 is I completely agree, and anything like 5 is bad in the teacher world. They're very positive people. So when 2/3 of teachers are coming back and saying, I had a really difficult time finding educational content on the digital content, and then once I found it, I had an incredibly difficult time understanding whether it was any good, I know that we have a communication problem coming from those of us that are supplying the content out there. And so again, my message there is simplify your messages and be very crystal clear as to what you're doing in the classroom for the teacher as opposed to the things that are happening behind the screen there. So I'm going to give you 3 things, which normally would be up here in beautiful print, that we think are really important as you go into this digital world. First, and most importantly, no matter what you're selling, is you have to communicate how you're raising the performance of students and closing the achievement gap. If you can't communicate that, you're kind of dead in the water, right? That's price of entry into this market share, or into this marketplace. But I think the communication of that has to be even more clear than it has been in the past. I walk in the door and say, let me show you how blank improves student learning in your school or in your district. The second is this concept of discovery. Make it very, very easy for people to understand what your product does and where and when to apply it, right? Really streamline your messaging so that in one bullet point somebody can say, oh, that's what it is and this is where I use it. And then finally, I think the third one, which is becoming increasingly more important, is providing really rich information on performance. You want to be in a position to almost advertise the key performance indicators by which your product should be judged. What should teachers be looking for to feel comfortable that this is working with their students, and how do they react if it's not? I think we often don't do as good a job of really communicating, here's what I do, here's how I do it, and by the way, here's the results you're going to see and how you should be tracking progress and evaluating my product in your classroom. Good data feedback is becoming increasingly important. If you're not spending a lot of time on your user interfaces, the ability for a digital product to kind of pop up like an app and a teacher can use it immediately without any professional training, et cetera, I think that's becoming really, really important. And again, if you look at the products that are being successful in the marketplace, though they're still supported by training, they don't need the training for a teacher to use them effectively. We'll switch over to Common Core for a minute. In 2013, about 75% of teachers supported the Common Core. Guess where that is right now? Anyone shout out a guess? It's down to about 50%, right? So all the negative marketing is taking its toll on the Common Core. If you describe the Common Core to teachers, though, without using the term, but just talk about the standards and how to be applied, what do you think the acceptance rate is? It's right up at about 80% still, right? So the Common Core has a real branding problem out there. We could have a great cocktail or coffee debate over whether Common Core is going to survive, whether PreK will be here in another 3 years. I don't know. But what I will tell you is I think that the standards that underlie Common Core are here to stay. They're here in Texas, right? They'll probably be there in Louisiana. They're going to be there in Florida. They may be called something different, but they're going to be here. And the reason that's becoming really important is if you're on the content side of the house, 2 years ago, even last selling season, you could go out and have a conversation with the chief academic officer where you could say, hey, we have mapped everything to the Common Core. And the chief academic officer will probably say, that's great, I really appreciate that, fantastic. This year, I think when you have that conversation, they're going to say, that's fantastic for you, but have you rewritten your content to be in tune with the philosophy behind the Common Core? Because the mapping was fine for a year, but I expected you to catch up. So I think what you see is, those that are at the cutting edge of this can come out and claim very legitimately that we wrote all of our content to the philosophy behind the Common Core, right? Those who had existing content have to go through a three-part migration here. First was map, second was fill the gap, and then this summer they should have been deep into rewriting all of the other core content. If you haven't thought through your migration plan on that, it's probably time to do so. Again, I think you're going to find some really difficult questions coming from the districts in the spring about how truly aligned your content is with, if not the Common Core, whatever is substituting for the Common Core in their state. I think we've all seen the fabulous map of who's moving in and out of the Common Core, but suffice to say, a lot of them are leaving PreK or SBAC, although I think it was Kansas. It was either Kansas or Oklahoma. One of those two had to leave because there was a state law saying they couldn't bid on it if they were a member of it. So they were kind of a shadow dropout. I think they're still aligned with the concept of Common Core, but because of the way the participation in the consortium worked, they literally had to drop out of the Common Core in order to purchase the tests from I think it was from PreK. But those are some of the realities. I think there are four things you have to keep in mind in the background when you're putting bets on Common Core long term. The first is the cost. A lot of people came in, and a lot of the early buzz around Common Core was that we'll band together and we'll dramatically lower the cost of the tests. Well, actually, that was a false premise. Testing actually has a cost curve that does scale, but after you get to the size of a moderate-sized state, actually, you don't get much efficiency from getting bigger, and actually, arguably, you start to lose efficiency. Most of the cost of assessment for the big summative exams is actually in the delivery and the collection and the processing of the forms, not in the creation of the test. So by banding together, you've reduced potentially the cost of 4, 5, or 6% of the total cost of a standardized test, but you've done nothing to impact the actual delivery cost. So we think that actually when you break it down, small states like Rhode Island or New Hampshire will benefit a bit from being in a consortia. but Texas, Florida, Georgia, California, they're not going to see cost benefits. And in fact, because of the complexity of the tests and the scoring that will be involved, in fact, many of them might see cost increases. The second is the political backlash. I think everybody's seen a ton of that. I think what's missing, right now the backlash is more about state control versus, the theory that this came from the federal government and the Gates Foundation, although actually it came from governors. But behind there, actually, the one that we think is really going to be impactful is when states try to achieve common definition of the cut scores by which you'll determine proficiency. It's very easy for us to come together as two states and establish what we think a set of standards are. It's actually quite difficult for us to come together and have a common definition of what mastery of that standard is at the age of 12. And so when you go in to start to make the cut scores, we think you're going to see some real political backlash there. And what it comes down to fundamentally is that most states have been lying to their constituents and the families in their state about how proficient their students are in reading and mathematics. If you take a decent proxy and take the NAEP test and look at the difference between proficiency state by state, between that and what their summative exams are, and you find gaps of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%. And so we think that that's when, when two states come together, or let alone 15, they're just not going to be able to establish cut points. So we think that that's the spot where the Common Core standards may stick around, but the actual assessments underlying them might run into some real strong political backlash. And in every state or district that's implemented a test around Common Core, right, you've seen massive plummeting in the percentage of students in their district who tested proficiency. Behind that actually is that the proficiency gap, as we see it today, it's inevitable that it will get larger as we migrate to new standards. The standards are tougher. The trend is towards making cut scores that are more difficult. And so we're going to see more and more students being identified as not as proficient as they should be. And where that's really going to be impactful is today, failing schools and unproficient students tend to be clustered in title districts, right? They tend to be clustered in urban areas. If we have anything approaching some of the standards that people talk about in Common Core, actually Weston and Wayland and places like that, really wealthy school districts, are going to find that they have lots of students that are not proficient as well. And so this concept of closing a performance gap is going to rotate from something that happens in urban school districts to something that's actually happening in every single school district in the nation, which I would argue is probably a good thing as people discover where young men and women really lie. And then the final part is the funding, the ability to implement. These were very ambitious, the consortium, very ambitious project, and the funding is actually, kind of not quite secured going forward. And they're all behind, and the amount of work that they have to do on what they've been contracted to do, let alone what they've talked about doing, is pretty tremendous. And that's important because those who are in the assessment area, I think, when the consortia first came out, there was a bit of a hiccup of, they said, oh, and we'll also have interim benchmark tests, and we'll do formative assessment, and we'll do this and that. And what you're finding out, I think, right now is that that was a bit ambitious and that those plans probably won't come to fruition for some time if they do at all. I want to switch over and talk a little bit about some key policy issues that we think are happening in school districts around the nation. And these are all what I would call subtle shifts. But they're subtle shifts that we think are happening and happening at a pace that you need to put in the back of your mind when you're communicating with senior leaders. The first is around human capital. For the past, 10 or so years, the discussion around human capital has been about teachers. How do we improve teacher performance? How do we evaluate teacher performance? How do we compensate teachers for growth as opposed to tenure? And we've had tons and tons of this discussion, and it's really dominated the debate, both in the press but also, at the senior leadership level. What we see happening right now is that there's a subtle shift happening where a lot of senior leaders are realizing great teachers without great leadership isn't very useful either, right? That I need both the improvement in the teacher, but I also need to enhance my leadership. And I think if you put that in the back of your mind again as you walk into districts and you talk about how you'll support the implementation of programs, being articulate about what you can do to support the leadership within the schools as well as the teachers becomes very important. That professional development or the tools you can put in the hands of leaders to allow them to be more effective, we're finding is becoming, it's not dominating the conversation, but it's starting to become a more loud portion of the conversation amongst senior leadership at districts. The second is around choice and partners. We went through a lot of soul searching in the nation as districts relinquished some of the direct instructional support, right? Charter schools, we've had increasingly, many of you who provide instructional content are increasingly taking on more of the instructional aspect of that content, whether it's a self-paced asynchronous or maybe you have tutors in the background that, can support the professionals in the school. But, this has dominated the conversation for a long time, but I think in some respects the horse is out of the barn, and what we're finding now is that districts are having to put in place a more sophisticated governance process that understands and can monitor and manage a whole bunch of different organizations that are delivering instruction either to students within their district, if it's a special ed carve-out, or to students in their classrooms or their school buildings in some sort of pull-out area. And I think if you accept that, it becomes again important to communicate, especially if you're in any area that is kind of augmenting teacher, right? So maybe I've got tutors in the background, I'm asynchronous, or I've got a carve-out program, or students come to me for a portion of their instruction. It's important to communicate very clearly how you can fit into that district's governance process, right? So it's an acknowledgement, hey, I'm going to be doing things that probably make you uncomfortable, right? And you have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that I'm performing these at exactly the levels that I've guaranteed. Here's how I fit into your governance structure. Here's how you can monitor me. Here's the service level agreements that I'm going to provide to you, and here's the repercussions that are going to happen if I don't meet them. I think you have to be very, 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 very blunt about that, which again steers over into accountability, which I mentioned before, which is just be very, very clear. Provide the metrics, provide the dashboards either to a teacher, a principal, or district administrator that demonstrate what's actually happening and how your programs or your services are being effective in the school. So those are my closing 3 comments. Vicki, I think we're just about on time. Deep apologies for not having slides. I will get those out, and people can either download them from our website or they'll be available through the conference here. But I'd like to open it up. Anybody's got a quick question or two, I'm happy to see if I can respond.
Good morning. Is this on? Dean Hyman from BrainPop. Thank you, Rob. Could you also address the role that you think privacy concerns are going to play in the coming year or so?
The private schools or?
No, privacy, student privacy and data.
Privacy, oh yeah, that's a tough one. I think this is an area I'm not an expert in, but here's what I'll say about the privacy issues. They're real, they're voracious, but previously, with a lot of digital content, districts wanted everything behind their firewall, right? So I wanted to have it installed behind my firewall. What we've seen districts getting more comfortable with, or maybe they're getting more uncomfortable with their own, is a realization that often their firewall is more permeable than your firewall. And so while the privacy issues are still real, I think the way they turn out in the marketplace is changing. So districts are increasingly comfortable with hosted solutions, even for things that will have very, very secure and sensitive data, provided you demonstrate how you're going to keep a lock on it all.
Yeah, Rob, Frank Catalano. Back in May, there was a Parthenon presentation that was a bit more optimistic about K-12 funding and spending. What's changed?
So nothing has changed macroeconomically, and I think it's more of probably the emphasis of the presenter. Maybe, my deck wasn't working, I didn't have enough coffee, Brady stunk last night, I'm just pessimistic this morning. But here's the facts, right? We believe that K-12 funding is going to come back at 3, 4, 5% over the next couple of years. So you can take your own point of view on whether that's an optimistic, a middle ground, or a pessimistic point. I just would caution you always, as you think about 3 or 4% growth in K-12 funding, almost all of that gets eaten up by pensions and health care, right? So what it's not allowing most districts to do is actually add back the services that they cut over the last 6 years, let alone add new services in. So I think that's the boundary between pessimism and optimism there.
My question concerns the future of assessment. Hello?
You're on.
No, it's me, here.
Oh. I was looking over here.
Ventriloquism. My question concerns the future of assessment. You know, in addition to the pushback about the Common Core, there's also a pushback about assessment. And I mean not only the pushback against the two consortia, which has to do with control issues, but also just a pushback about the frequency of assessment. I'm wondering if you could comment on a sort of a hypothetical argument that that pushback could provide political cover for states that would actually like to reduce the frequency of assessments, in part to get around this issue of plunging assessment and accountability problems.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, and this issue of assessment, right, testing and assessment, it's a really deep social question that we grapple with as a nation. I'll give you 2 points of view on it. One is just a very probably sarcastic one, since that seems to be the mood I'm in. As a nation, we seem to love testing people and love complaining about the testing. Right? So we do a lot of testing in this nation, and we all complain about it, and yet we continue to do it. And so we seem to have right now as a society a desire, a need, and a willingness to know where people stand. So I don't think testing is going away in the near future. If I then turn it into how it really happens in the classroom, we see a couple things. Most teachers are very comfortable using a variety of assessments to build a fairly robust picture of the student. So, you know, they're more than happy to use, you know, tests from last year, a formative assessment, an interim benchmark, one from here and one from there, to build a reasonably robust picture of where a student stands. Their challenge right now is twofold. One, the quicker you can make that test, the happier I am. So I don't like all-day testing, but if you can get it down to 15 or 20 minutes to assess where a student's reading capability is, that's really helpful for me. The second is getting the feedback from the testing. You know, individual tests tend to come back with very incomprehensible and difficult to read results. Give them a good user interface. Give them simplicity that they can drill down on. And the second is, you actually look at a teacher trying to make an assessment of where students in the classroom are, they will literally have tons of things laid out on a table in front of them, right? Because I'm using all these multiple instruments. And so getting all these multiple instruments to work together and make sense is a real pain point. So I don't think we're going to see a move away from assessments. I do agree that we could see a break point in some of the assessments on a political level. But if I get into the things that the teacher uses to actually drive the classroom, I think those are here to stay because they're useful. Those of you who make them more useful will be better positioned in the marketplace.
Yeah, Kevin McAlilly from Think Through Learning. Playing off that last point, when do you think districts will get to the point where they can take their dashboards, take all the data they get, and then see how kids do and tie that back to the software so that companies or software that works will get rewarded just by the data flow? And by the way, very impressive that you could do that off with no preparation off the top of your head. So
yeah, I'm gonna go home and cry. Never, I think, is the answer. I don't believe in a world where, you know, assessment data seamlessly flows through some system and magically informs instruction and everything just happens instantaneously. It's some sort of platonic ideal out there. We'll progressively work towards it and getting better and better, but every step you take, you realize something's not working as well as it can. So I think the art of the journey is what's key here. We call it the so what, now what, right? You know, the better I get at saying, so what, like what does the child not know or where do they need help, the more critical it becomes for me to give you the now what, which is what should you do. I think what you're seeing is a move towards open systems. I think those that have developed very closed-loop systems, so I assess the student and then I give you my content to remediate or to close that gap, and then I assess you again. There's a natural bias against that, right? Teachers are human and they just don't look at you and believe that you actually have the best of everything, right? So I'll buy that. You know, if you come and tell me you have a closed loop tier 2 mathematics intervention for grades, 3 through 5, well, I'll evaluate you, and if I think that's true, I'll go ahead and use your closed loop system. If you come to me and say you have comprehensive software for an entire elementary school that's a closed loop system, I'm like, I can't believe that you're the best in math and biology. So open loop systems that point to others' content, I think, are becoming important. And this is where actually a more common core than we used to have becomes more helpful because we can all write standards to a more uniform set of standards, and therefore a teacher can have a little more plug and play. A little more. Continuity of voice is still fairly important, especially in early years. So you don't want to do a chapter from here and a chapter from there, but you can supplement it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. I'm Tessa Joles from the Center for Media Literacy. I'd like to know, most of the attention, of course, is always on public schools, but how do you see the growth of the homeschool market and also private schools?
I'll start with private schools. They're growing, but tortuously slowly. Most people can't afford a private school. That's just the reality of life. Within private schools, you see a real movement right now, shrinking in religious schools or in Catholic schools specifically, growth in evangelical schools and growth in non-sectarian schools. And those that are closer to a somewhere between $17,000 and $20,000 price point are growing quicker. But high growth in that marketplace is still fairly low growth on an overall basis, simply because of the affordability. I will tell you that I was talking with somebody yesterday, and there's some really innovative things happening in the private school market, particularly with the Catholic schools. The sector's not dead; it's still thriving, but it's still a reasonably small part. I think the real interesting action is obviously in charter schools, public charter schools, where growth is really a function of policy and not of demand. Every time you offer more charters or lift the lid on charter caps in a state, charter school market grows. There's still a tremendous demand, and that demand actually sits both in urban school districts where arguably some of the schools are really, really bad, and it sits in middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods. I don't know if you're familiar with Basis schools out of Tucson, Arizona, but they run charter schools in reasonably strong districts and still get great demand. It's because they're offering a different program, right? A single value proposition of one school with one education philosophy and pedagogy. There's not another consumer market in the world that has one value proposition in one segment, right? So there's multiple segments out there, and as the charter schools and the private schools start to appeal to different segments of the population, they'll have success.
Hey, Rob, Wayne Harvey from EDC. You've provided really a tremendous spectrum of really interesting and useful perspectives and advice. Could you share a little bit of the methodologies you've used in your work to build those perspectives and the kind of evidence you collect? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, our perspective, I usually run through what informs our perspective, but I was a little frazzled. It comes from a couple places. We do a tremendous amount of work with school districts and local education authorities, both here in the United States and abroad, so working directly with districts. And I would say, whatever you're reading about in the paper is a big issue is probably something we're working on somewhere. So we've done a lot on, school governance, teacher compensation, teacher incentives, closing performance gaps, dropout prevention and recovery. But we also do a lot of work with those of you in the room who do a lot of provision of services and products into the district. So a lot of work with publishers and testing assessment companies. Most of the data that I walk through is, or the things I walk through is a combination of just the conversations we've been in or very direct primary research that we've executed in the market. Any other questions? I think I've hit my time hack here, so I will turn it back over to Vicki. Thanks, everybody, and really apologize for not having slides.